You are listening to the Baobab Project. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us under the Baobab tree from wherever you are in the world today. We are joining you from Halifax, Nova Scotia. We've got so much to explore, from culture to lifestyle to health, relationships, education, and so much more. Now over to our podcast host for today.
Good day and welcome to the second podcast, and welcome onto the Baobab tree. We are going to discuss All Lives Matter today, and we have in our midst Al Jones, Ayoka Junaid, and Sharisha. And I'm going to ask you to just sit back and relax and listen to our discussion. And I'm going to ask Elle at this moment to just give a brief introduction.
So, hey everybody. I was going to say good morning or good afternoon, and then I didn't know when we were playing it. But hey everybody. My name's Elle Jones. I live here in Jabuktuk, Halifax. And I've been an organizer most of my adult life, particularly on the issues of prisons, state violence, people facing deportations, and issues impacting Black women. And along with that, I do writing. So I'm a journalist and a poet, and I also teach. So.
Thank you, Elle. Ayoka, can you jump in there now, please?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ayoka Junaid. I am a person who lives with disability. I'm also an interpreter, a community-minded person, and have been a community activist most of my life as well.
Thanks, Ayoka. And Sharisha, can you go forward now, please? Thanks.
Hey, everyone. My name's Sharisha. I wouldn't exactly call myself an activist. I'm just somebody who won't stay silent.
Thank you all. So this is a very interesting topic that we're going to explore today. And I know many of you might have questions out there. And I'm hoping that today we'll be able to answer a lot of those questions. But at the end of it all, we aim to educate our community. As you sit under the Baobab tree with us, just relax and know that we are going to explore knowledge based on our own experiences within the community and some of our personal experiences as well. I'm going to start by asking Elle to explain what should we know about Black Lives Matter.
So I think, first of all, there's perhaps two different things that we're talking about. So there's Black Lives Matter, the specific chapters, the specific leadership. And some people may have been following some of the conversations around things like Black Lives Matter Global Network, for example, where there's been a bit of controversy around money, relationships to the victims, like the families of victims of killing, stuff like that. So there's the specific thing that's Black Lives Matter and that specific leadership. But then there's also, of course, the broader movement of Black Lives Matter that Black people across the world have related to, and that you don't have to be in a chapter or, officially part of the movement to be engaged in. And that's everything from, people that are wearing the shirts, people who've attended a protest, people who see the work they're doing that may not be officially under the BLM banner, but is related to it. So they've been doing work in their communities on anti-Black racism, or they already have been working on policing, or they're tied to those issues. So I think in that sense, we're almost talking about two different things, like the official movement and the small amount of people that are officially involved in that leadership, but then the much broader way that Black people in this moment related to something really beginning with Trayvon Martin, right? And the moment where Trayvon Martin was killed, and there was a sort of shift at that point, and that was 2012. And so many Black people at that point, of course, with that killing were so outraged. And of course, Robert Zimmerman claiming stand your ground. And then, of course, Mike Brown in 2013 and the Ferguson uprising that came from that. And that, of course, led into the official Black Lives Matter movement. But I think in general, we're not necessarily talking about membership of BLM to be talking about what BLM means to people, which more broadly has been this mass movement against state violence, against racism, against the status quo, where Black people have really been recognizing that, the system isn't working for us on many levels. He's starting talking about policing, but that conversation has expanded to be like universities, education system. Ayoka's going to talk about disability in Black people, right? So it's a much broader conversation of how Black people live and exist in this world and the various barriers and obstacles we faced historically and now. And so we're having a number of conversations connected to that.
Yeah, why don't we get Ayoka to jump right in there? And I see you have some additional points to add to this, Ayoka.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that Elle is saying, and it's so important for us to acknowledge that activism actually happens in many different ways, and that people can contribute. As Elle, pointed out, some of the ways that people contribute. People can contribute in all kinds of ways, and particularly starting with developing a really personal relationship and understanding of what it actually means to say that somebody's life matters or
Yeah.
a group of people's lives matter. And so for me, in regards to thinking about Black Lives Matter, I think when we think about Black Lives Matter, we're thinking about all Black lives, whether those be, the lives of Black people with disabilities, LGBTQ, Black folks, and other folks within the community that are often not either recognized or supported by community, and just considering ways that we can make sure that we support people within the community who are often at the margins. How we do that within community also helps us to model for folks who aren't from our communities the level of kind of respect and engagement that we would like to see in terms of showing that Black lives matter and therefore all lives matter.
Very good points. And let's hear from Sharisha. See what you have to say here, Sharisha.
I agree with what both of them have said so far. To me, personally, like, I just feel like Black Lives Matter is just, it's something that you have to be dedicated to. You can't just dip your foot in and say, oh, I've done enough and that's okay, and now I can say I've done something, like, but you got to continue to keep going on and doing your parts, whether they're small parts or not, even just speaking up when you see something that's going on that's wrong or anything like that. But I feel like it needs to be something that you are absolutely dedicated in doing. For me.
Yeah, absolutely. Elle, you raised a very good point, and you provided some historical background here on Black Lives Matter, and you all did, in a sense. But Elle, you've mentioned some cities in the U.S. that we ought to pay attention to as as to where Black Lives Matter and why Black Lives Matter started. But I'm going to ask Ayoko to jump in here and help us to understand, how did Black Lives Matter make its way into the Canadian streets?
Certainly, I'll speak from my own experience of when I encountered Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
I would encourage listeners to do some of that research on their own if they're interested in exactly when Black Lives Matter started in Canada, because often when we take a perspective of which is more of, let's say, more of a Eurocentric way of looking at things, we often want to be able to say, this is the date, this is the time. And certainly there are individuals who did that work, bringing it forward. But even those individuals would say that their work is grounded and rooted in the work of those who came before them. I wanted to, in the interest of just sharing a short experience of my own of working my consciousness around Black Lives Matter in Canada, started with Black Lives Matter Toronto, and hearing about freedom schools in Toronto and investigating those, and then being offered the privilege of doing some work as an interpreter with Black Lives Matter. In the summer of 2016, Black Lives Matter were the grand marshals of the Toronto Pride Parade. I interpreted on that float. That is, I would say, in some ways, Black Lives Matter had been, for a significant period of time, lobbying the government, lobbying police within Toronto to investigate the assaults against, killings of, in particular, Black trans folks and Black gay folks. And those individuals were being ignored. They are also marginalized within our communities. And so at that Pride Parade, Black Lives Matter, it was shortly after the Oracle massacre that happened in Florida, where somebody went in and murdered a number of Black and Brown, and particularly Black and Brown LGBTQ folks. And so Black Lives Matter was invited to be the Grand Marshal to lead the parade. There's so many different layers to that story, but the particular piece that for me grounded me in actually then starting to use the term myself was when I stood on that float. everybody, the million people who came out to watch it, everybody was engaged. They were happy. They were interested in watching it. They didn't acknowledge that the float was actually a funeral dirge in some ways. They were calling people's names of the 49 people who were slaughtered. They were saying their names. They were throwing roses out into the crowd, loud music. It was a celebration of life. And when they got to the corner of where 52 Division is in Toronto, they stopped the float. And it was a beautiful moment, despite what was presented in the media. Black Lives Matter, then the leaders left that float and went and stood in the intersection. There was an Indigenous float behind that. The Indigenous drummers came off of their float and surrounded the Black Lives Matter folks, allowed so that they were able to speak. What happened in that moment was that all these people who'd come out to see the parade started to do things like shooting us with their water guns, telling us to go back to where we came from. It was a pretty ugly moment in many ways, but it was incredibly beautiful to see the solidarity between Black and Brown folks and Indigenous folks around supporting each other in that moment. And it was what brought to me the importance of not just having those conversations around, a dinner table. It was important to start to say Black Lives Matter out loud and to talk about why that was important. So that's just one particular example around that. As I said, I don't want to speak for the leaders of that particular movement, but it's certainly something that has been happening in the country, right across the country.
All right, Elle, can I get you to jump in on this same question? How did Black Lives Matter make its way into the Canadian streets?
Well, if people are interested in this history, there's actually a book, Until We Are Free, edited by Sandy Hudson, Rodney DeVerlis, and Cyrus Marcus Ware, all members of Black Lives Matter Toronto. And it tells the history of the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada. So that's Until We Are Free. And people should pick that book up for a more extensive history. But it really began in Canada. I think, first of all, and there's a really important thing here, is Black Lives Matter is not the only first or sole movement of Black people, not clearly in history and not of our time either. And so there's a way that, of course, yes, we use the phrase Black Lives Matter in a way that people relate to. But I think it would be a mistake to think that like Black activism hit Canada at the moment that, say, like BLM hit Canada. In Halifax, for example, we were having conversations in 2013 about whether to start a chapter, and we decided not to, largely because we thought that there was already an activist history in Nova Scotia, and we didn't really want to import something on top of that, as though to say that the history here from people like Rocky, Black communities in the 60s, Buff, all of these movements that existed here, we didn't really want to sort of subsume those into the idea that all real activism comes out of the United States. And that was a conscious decision a lot of us made at that time when we were kicking around the idea of should we have a chapter. And that doesn't mean that's a decision for all time, but that was a discussion we were having in 2013.
Absolutely.
And like Jade Peak was one of the people that was really part of doing like the Black Lives Matter reading group. Some of the young people at NASCAD had started a reading group there and were following the curriculum, but also sort of made a decision that we didn't want a chapter. So I say that to say that there's a long history of anti-state activism in Nova Scotia, a long history of Black activism stretching back into the 1700s and before. And we should be very mindful of that. But in this particular movement, it was really 2013 and the protests in solidarity for Mike Brown. We actually had one here in August of 2013, and Sandy Hudson, Jay Khan, Yusra Kogali, these are people that organized in Toronto and then really kept going from there. And they were able to connect with Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, the people that were starting the movement in the United States. And that's what led Toronto to being the first chapter founded in Canada, because they went and worked with the founders of the American chapter and brought it into Toronto. So that was sort of the official move, was through the Mike Brown protest. But Canada, and I think this is really important because, of course, we often forget there was a civil rights movement in Canada. We forget there was segregation in Canada. We don't know slavery in Canada. And, of course, all of that oppression has come with Black movements that have been fighting and standing up for that. And, of course, at a very grassroots level, at a working class level within Black communities. So when, North Preston has organized to get resources in their community, when you see, the Square organizing, when you see people in rural communities organizing, we don't want to leave that out of our narrative of what a Black resistance and a Black movement looks like. So especially in Nova Scotia, I think it's very important to ground that in the 400 plus year history that Black
absolutely
in this territory as well.
Absolutely. Very good points there, Al. And thanks for clearing this up as well. That we are not importing, or we haven't been importing ideas from such as Black Lives Matter from the US in all that 400 plus years of history. Black people in North America, in Nova Scotia, has been working diligently with government to see changes to their lives. And thanks for clearing that up. And for listeners, Until We Are Free, that was the book that was recommended. Thanks, Al, for providing that information. Sharisha, I'm going to jump to you now. How about you help us to understand this clearly? Black Lives Matter is often associated with police brutality. Is this what Black Lives Matter is all about?
Black Lives Matter is more than just the police brutality. It's about the unfair treatment of people of color in any situation, whether that be in schools or workplaces or politics and etc. There is so much more than just the police brutality. I feel personally that the police brutality is mainly the main focus because that is the most publicized. With camera phones and everything like that. So like over the years that people are being pushed in that direction because that's the only thing they see. But it is so much more than just the police brutality, 100%.
Thanks, Sharisha. I'm going to ask Ayoka to jump in just to explain, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you, as it often is associated with police brutality in the wider community. Just take that moment to explain, what does it mean to you?
Black Lives Matter for me means many things, and I'm going to focus on just one or two. One of them would be, I have a young child, and Black Lives Matter for me is creating a world where he can freely go to school, go out, be part of his community, and not be targeted because of other people's hatred. That would be a very broad, but a very personal reason as to why Black Lives Matter to me. Black Lives Matter to me because much as when I come to many things with the focus of looking at it around accessibility and disability justice, is if we support those who are most at risk in our communities, then we support everyone. And I look at it as in, when Black Lives Matter, everybody's lives matter. Because when we're taking a perspective of our collective responsibility for each other as communities, both for the children, for each other. I use the term both, but I really mean just in terms of the community, for each other, for others in our community. Then when we do that and we do it well, then it becomes a model for what broader society can do in terms of being able to care for those who are within the community.
Yeah. Al, I'm going to ask you to jump in on that same question. What does Black Lives Matter mean to you?
Yeah, so I mean, there is obviously an official platform, Black Lives Matter. If you go to the site, you can see the official Black Lives Matter platform. And obviously, traditionally, a lot of the work on people killed by police has come from Black Lives Matter. But then everybody relates that differently. For me, I do think it's really important to emphasize the role of the state and that we're fighting state violence. So I don't want to say concern because everyone's going to deal with it differently. And again, like what it means to people is very individual. But I think as a movement, I think it's really important to keep focused on the systemic issue of the state rather than necessarily every issue that impacts Black people. And that's one of the things that happens with BLM is sort of everything that's Black, now we just name BLM. And this is feminism, right? Like then we say like any choice a woman makes is feminist and that's feminism. But sometimes we do have to separate the social way we live out something from the political demands. And the reason why I say that is because if we don't stay focused on things like prisons, police, borders, shelters, forensics hospitals, the places where people face the most violence, we risk happening exactly what Ayoka identified here, is that we need to be for all Black lives, not just the most privileged Black lives. And so sometimes we fall into a thing where we think if we only have more Black representation at high levels, more Black politicians, more Black doctors, more Black judges, more Black prison guards, more Black police chiefs, that will solve the system. And that forgets about the mass of Black people who are fighting daily for like food and human rights and shelter and just being seen as a human being. So to me, it is really important to keep focused on where is oppression the most violent.
Yeah.
And Black people can't live in their place without being evicted. We need to see that as important. When Black people are being criminalized and stopped on the streets, when Black mothers are having their children taken away from them by social workers, not because they use the child, but because there's an unfit parent. When Black children are being suspended or have cops in their schools, are being, beaten up. When Black children can't live and walk on the street or go to a store without being stopped. That's part of a broader issue of the way that Black life is not seen as human, and the way that the powers of the state, meaning police, institutions, courts, the people in power, government, economics, all those decisions have traditionally been made in ways that exclude us, that deny us deny us quality of life. So I always want us to focus not on the most privileged Black people, not on it's part of it. Yes, obviously, when Black lives matter, we will see Black people reflected at our highest levels. But I don't think we start there. I think we start with fighting evictions, making sure that Black women aren't living in shelters, dealing with violence in our communities, and learning how to do transformative justice and heal each other. Those are also really important parts of the movement for me.
Yeah. Well, I want to stop and let's break this down a little bit more for the general public. What does when I say Black Lives Matter, why can't I just say all lives matter and get over with it? Why do I have to specifically use the term Black Lives Matter to identify that there are issues in our society affecting one group of people? Wouldn't it be easier to say to authority, all lives matter? And here are a group of people being affected. Why don't you take care of them? Sharisha, can you help me understand that and help the general public understand why we have to use the term Black Lives Matter to discuss the issues that we face?
I like to always use this reference for anybody who ever asks me that question. When you enter an ER at the hospital, there are many people in there with different situations that are happening, but always the main focus will be a gunshot victim or a head trauma victim, as opposed to a person with a broken arm, where this person they're bleeding, they need help immediately, whereas the other person is manageable at the moment, and we don't need to take further action. And I see it as that the same way, like with Black Lives Matter, is yes, all lives matter, but right now our community of Black people, of people of color, are hurting, they're bleeding, they need to be looking and taken care of immediately. And no, I'm not saying that white lives don't struggle, and I'm not saying that, they're any less important, but right now our people of color are the ones who need the help.
Yeah. Ahilka, I'll have you jump in and just with the same question.
Thank you, Randy. I absolutely agree with everything that Sharisha has said there, and actually, as both Elle and Sharisha have said so far, I have come to try not to get engaged in red herring discussions. And so when somebody says all lives matter, it's that individual can afford the opportunity to play with language and debate. When there is, as Sharisha mentioned, when you're in a hospital, in the ER, they triage. Most certainly when there was the forest fire down in Lake Echo a number of years ago, and it was burning through the community, the level of insensitivity to respond when somebody is in a crisis moment and say, well, all houses matter, or all forest fires matter, basically is not something that I actually want to give any energy. I do understand why you would want to bring this up in this discussion in order to encourage the communities of people who are listening to really consider that. But I don't want to give it a lot of ear, because I really do feel that it's one of those discussions that's really just used to take people away from what the central point is, which is that people are being treated as though they are subhuman and that they do not deserve to live, and that they should always be in a position of being grateful if they are not experiencing overt violence in a given moment. I realize I haven't answered your question, but that's because that's quite intentional.
No, that's perfect. I love the answer. So, El, I'm going to get you to jump in on this question now. So, if taking what Ayoka said and what Sharisha said, if we go in with the perspective that, okay, let's focus on this specific group of people, Blacks in this movement and in this era, sorry. Is that promoting any form of segregation?
Well, this is the same idea as that talking about racism makes us racist, right? So sometimes you get this discourse that, Obama was the most divisive president because he talked about race, as though the existence of race and racism isn't, what was divisive. So we constantly see this response, which is really the default to the status quo, and people that feel that anything that makes us uncomfortable is therefore bad and divisive. And of course, in order to change things, we have to stir things up and make people uncomfortable, and people have to reassess, and we have to change the basis of society. So what people hear when you say Black Lives Matter is only Black Lives Matter. And historically seen as every time Black people try to assert ourselves in just the barest facts of humanity, there is pushback. So the idea that, if we for a minute focus on what Black people need or talk about Black people, that somehow we're doing other people a disservice. We constantly also hear this, right? That Black people have to carry everybody else's water before we can have a cup of our own. Yet we are consistently at the bottom of every single indicator, whether that's health, education, employment, youth employment. Every indicator of well-being shows that Black people, there's a massive gap, or like Black women dying in childbirth. Child poverty, our housing gap. No matter what measure you choose, Black people will take generations to catch up. Even if full equality, equity was granted us tomorrow, it would take us years and years and years to come back from that. So I think we also have to think really seriously around what's going on when people get so scared and threatened when Black people dare to speak the words Black people or Black Lives Matter, right? How that's seen as excluding other people. Yet, of course, for generations, things were all white and nobody batted an eyelid, right? Even now, when people are saying, Black people, you can't get a job if you're white, or Black people have this. And then we're looking at, universities getting like their first Black hires, or, they're graduating their first Black PhDs. Like, we're still doing firsts in 2021.
2021, that's right.
So I think that huge gap, it's obvious that, that's not sustainable for an entire society. COVID being an example of this, right? Like, one thing that COVID shows us is when we have these social gaps, when you have groups of people that are being left out economically and socially, when you have a crisis like COVID, then that's played out in who dies, who gets sick, who loses the job. And then that, of course, causes a social cascade. So COVID taught us that the well-being of the least is important for the well-being of all of us. If we didn't know this already, the health of everybody was only as good as the person with the poorest healthcare, right? So you can have a great doctor, but if somebody else is homeless and doesn't have access and gets COVID, they can spread it to you. And so we can use the same analogy as a society. If we just consistently think that we can have a group of people that are going to have poorer outcomes in every way, and that's a healthy society, as though that isn't going to affect everybody. So again, as I said, the missing words in Black Lives Matter aren't only Black Lives Matter and white lives don't. It's when Black Lives Matter, all lives will matter. Because the things that we're fighting for will benefit everyone. When we fight for changes in the justice system, white people are killed by the police. And of course, there's more white people in Canada, so more white people are killed by the police. So when we fight for things like no cop mental health, that will benefit everybody. When we fight against the justice system and unfair trials and disproportionate sentencing and the conditions in prisons, that benefits everybody who ends up in prison, which includes white people with disabilities and white people with poor mental health and white people with addictions and white people living in poverty. So that will always be comprehended in our movement because we are fighting for broader justice that will go beyond. And we are constantly fighting for other people. So if we go back to Black Lives Matter TO, in the parade, people forget that when they stopped Pride, they demanded more accessibility, stages like sign language and translation at all stages for the disability community as a whole. They wanted the return of stages that are being cut for other communities, like the South Asian stages. They were asking for inclusion of Indigenous people. So there's never been a point where Black people have ever said, we're in our own boat and get away first. We always do fight for other people. And you see that on the very basis of the demands that BLMTO made. So it's not that our fight isn't for everybody. It's that people get so threatened when we dare to assert ourselves as Black people and immediately say that divisive or segregation or hateful. And so we've never been allowed to organize ourselves or simply see ourselves as human beings.
Yeah, really good points. And here is a proverb. So remember, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. So Ioka did make this point earlier as well, that when Black Lives Matter, all lives will matter. These are some very strong points that you've raised. So Sharisha, can you help us to understand then? Does Black Lives Matter says that only Black Lives matter?
Like we've just discussed before, that there's never been a only Black Lives Matter part to this. We're just saying that simply we are just asking to matter, and it's pretty shameful that we have to ask that we matter at all in any sense. But it's definitely not ever being exclusive to just Black people. We have allies of every race and every nationality and all types of people. It's never just about Black people, like Elle said, that we help everybody.
Al, why don't you jump in and answer this next question? I'm just looking at something that happened in the Arab Spring, and one of the founders did relate the Black Lives Matter movement to the Arab Springs because it has spread so far and wide. Can you help us to understand how this movement was able to spread so far and maintain momentum?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things, and this is also, I think it's a generational piece that's part of the BLM movement. So sort of shifting from the civil rights generation. And of course, that was through the 60s. And then there was kind of a lull that you had, our elders kind of being like, I marched in the civil rights movement. And then it was like, that had accomplished everything. And then what did we do? And Obama came in, we were supposed to be post-racial. So you had all these different kind of historical pieces, and young people in particular were like, all of this civil rights, all of this Obama, and we're still left behind, and we can't feed our kids, and we can't get to college, and we're in debt, and the cops are shooting us. So BLM was also a particular moment of a young person's uprising, and that partly was about generational stuff within the Black community in terms of people feeling like some of these elders are no longer fighting for us, are not fighting in the way we need, or have become complacent or become part of the system, right? So a lot of people then went on to become like representatives in Congress and stuff themselves. And there was a sense that you had this mass of Black people that were increasingly getting left behind, not just within the Black community, but more globally, right? Like young people in general globally that, are in debt, that can't get housing. The jobs exist in the same way. And of course, because of the wealth gap, Black people are particularly affected by that. So I think it's also really important to understand that this movement was about young people also in some ways overthrowing their elders and being like, we need something new. Like, we can't keep talking about civil rights. That was like 60 years ago, and it's 60 years now, and we ain't got what we were promised, so time for another movement. And so what was important about is it was leader-led. Like, there is a leadership to BLM, like officially, but people respond to it in a much more collective way. So particularly if you think of Martin Luther King, of course, and this is a danger people raised at the time, they weren't unaware of this, that when you have a big charismatic leader, then when that leader is killed, you can kill off the movement in particular ways, right? And so BLM was that like anybody can start a chapter, anybody can be BLM, anybody is an activist, everybody has the capacity to do liberation work in their own way, in their own community. And that's what I think made it spread, that people just related to it in their own way. And this person over here is like, I'm a mother and I relate to it because my child's getting suspended and I'm fighting the school district. And this person over here is like, I'm fighting the police. And this person over here is like, I think we need to talk about gendered violence and Black women. And this person over here might be talking about disability. And like everybody has their own way to do work within the movement. And I think everybody sort of just took on this idea of our lives matter and went from there. And I think that's what really made it spread. So like Sharisha, for example, when you did the huge protest this summer, like you can talk about that, right? Like what made you do that and just stepping up and doing that and how many people related to that and came out. Like that's definitely on point for this question.
Yeah. So Sharisha, why don't I get you to jump right in there and talk about that protest?
I was just thinking of watching my family go through the struggles of everyday Black life, particularly it started when my brother was mistreated in the jail system. The biggest thing that hit me was how he was brutally was in coma, and immediately, obviously, we had rushed to the hospital, and he was treated like a prisoner the entire time he was there. He was handcuffed to a bed even while being in coma. We weren't allowed to see him. We had to fight to even have one person in the room with him while he was literally dying. And my little sister, who is 7, God bless, she hasn't had to experience anything yet, but just thinking of the things that could potentially happen to her, and I just couldn't imagine not doing anything about that. So when the George Floyd situation happened, it was me almost kind of just seizing the moment and taking the opportunity to let people know that it's just more than George Floyd. It's just more than police brutality. Like, it happens everywhere, and it needed to stop. So I kind of just, went from there and said, let's get everybody involved. Let's have everybody understand the situation and understand that it also happens here in Canada, and it happens in Nova Scotia, and it's a big deal, and it needs to be dealt with.
Why don't we take a break right now and we'll get right back into the discussion. This is very exciting for us today. And just want to remind you that we're still under the baobab tree. And as we discuss Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, I'll remind you of our guests today. It's Ayoka, Elle, and Sharisha. Let's get back into the discussion very, very shortly. Thank you. All right, and welcome back. Just as a reminder, we are onto the baobab tree, and I want to welcome you today as we continue to discuss our Black Lives Matter movement and take a closer look at All Lives Matter. We will jump right back into the question we were discussing before the break. I'll bring Ayoko back into the discussion and ask her to describe some of the leaders coming out of the movement, because historically, charismatic men received recognition. They were the heroes and presented very little space for any other agenda. Ayuka, how could you describe or explain that for us?
Thank you for the question, Randy. I, first of all, note that it is a much more, I think, within our communities, and also a very much Eurocentric way of kind of identifying one man who is going to be lifted up, or a number of men who will be lifted up as leaders or heroes. And this is kind of in direct contradiction to how our various communities have worked since the beginning of time. Often it is women who are the ones who recognize issues that need to be addressed and take action accordingly. Leadership is defined in different ways, and sometimes the leadership is coming in ways that is not about the individual recognition. For example, if we're just going to focus on the Black Lives Matter movement in United States, it was started by Alicia Garza, Patrice Colliers, and Opal Tometi. If anybody's interested in her story, please do go on to blm.com, and they give their history and how they started this work. Locally, I think it's important to acknowledge the work of Black women here who have been pushing forward Black Lives Matter here in Nova Scotia. And, two of those individuals are here in this call. That would be Sharisha, who earlier on in our discussion talked about her rationale for mobilizing folks around Black Lives Matter earlier in the summer of 2020. And then something that has happened here in the city, which I find very interesting, that I don't hear a lot of talk about, but particularly speaks to this question, is the Black Lives Matter Halifax Solidarity Fund that Lynn Jones and Rachel Zellers mobilized to provide funding for community members who are hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic very early on, long before any level of government was providing any form of assistance, and continues to support communities in
different ways and have leveraged that fund to be able to provide longer term supports within communities, I don't hear people saying, let's make space for these 4 women to be recognized in their work, and that their contributions will continue to resonate and ripple forward. And so I don't accept the notion that women have not been leaders. What I do accept is the idea that women's contribution has been repeatedly and deliberately suppressed or erased.
Oh, thank you a lot there, Ayoka. Al, could you jump in there and help us to understand what's so different about this movement? Ayoka did list a few notable women who are participating in the Black Lives Matter movement locally, including yourself, and she listed the names of the founders as well of the Black Lives Matter movement. What's so different about this movement compared to, let's say, the civil rights movement in the U.S. or other movements that we've had in Canada in previous decades?
Well, first of all, I noticed that Ayoka left herself out of the list of women who were contributing, which is a very perhaps woman thing to do, where women are taught within the collective often, not because of something biological in us, but because of how women are socially raised, right? And I think many of those skills are what translates to women's skill at organizing, because women are trained as born organizers from the time that we are children. We're trained to know the feelings of others around us. We're trained to manage people. We're trained to manage conflict. We're trained in nurturing. And we don't call those political skills. And historically, those skills have been feminized and therefore put at less than the person who stands at the front of the rally, right? So we come to understand leadership as the person who has the microphone and not the person who brought together the people, who made the flyers, who, made the coffee, who was able to make all the calls, who knows all the people and knows who to call the right person. And a lot of those things have historically been women's skills. Like if we look at the women's auxiliaries in African Nova Scotia in the African Baptist Church, right, that have traditionally held down that major organizing work. For a lot of history, the idea was, and then a man came in, usually at the last minute, didn't move a chair or make the coffee and was sent to the front. And that's because of gender roles, right? And that's not to indict the men either. This is not just in our community. This is, of course, the gender roles that exist in broader society. And so as Ayoka talked about, people don't know the names of the women who taught Martin Luther King. People like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark. He turned to them when he needed organizing help. Everything from they had trained at the field schools. They had trained in songwriting. They were the ones that knew the freedom songs and taught them. They had all those skills, and most people don't know their names. And we see that extended still into the present. What Black Lives Matter, and this is one reason why I think there's been some pushback on them, is they're not just led by women largely, it's by queer women and queer people, queer and trans people in general. So whether you look at Black Lives Matter Toronto, of course, most famous for their appearance in the Black Lives Matter, in the Pride March, right? And when that happened, people couldn't even comprehend that Black people were also queer. So they were they're crashing the march as though they didn't belong there, right? The whole discourse was, how dare they come into our march and then hold up our march, as though Black people could not be queer. So queer people are imagined as white and Black people are imagined as not queer. And then among certain, particularly conservative or perhaps churched up elements of the Black community, there's been a reluctance sometimes to embrace specifically the leadership, and I want to put that in quotes because I'm going to get that to a minute, of Black Lives Matter, because a queer person doesn't speak for me, or a woman doesn't speak to me, or a trans person doesn't speak for me, right? Discourse that women never activate when it's men leading us. We're not oh, a man doesn't speak for me. We accept that, it's a full community, but you often kind of hear that discourse, whether that's drawn out of the Bible, suffer not a woman to speak or whatever, or out of other areas. So there's still some challenge to that. I do think, though, and this has changed lately because there's been obviously the controversy with money within the main Black Lives Matter global network, and that's been quite an issue of conversation among Black people and the ethical concerns around money. But one of the things that was significant in the movement more broadly was that, anybody could start a chapter. It was a diffuse leadership structure. So even though there are these official leaders in your own city, like the chapters could go their own way. Nobody was telling BLM what to do. So this idea that there are multiple and many leaders, this is something Desmond Cole wrote about in his book, The Skin We're In, when he talks about BLM and talks about how to this day, you cannot find a journalist in Canada who's like names the leadership of Black Lives Matter Toronto, because they have no idea, because there's like more than one. And the media, and as Ayoka said, representing this European like white organization, always needs there to be one leader, one person. Who do we go to? Who's the person? And Black Lives Matter Toronto at their height had like a dozen people and more that were in, that were part of that movement and that were making decisions, that were leading it. So I think that's a difference we've seen that, of course, is drawn upon more African collective forms of culture that we've often forgotten about as we learn to prioritize patriarchy, capitalist, like hierarchies. There can only be one. This idea that the leader has to be this charismatic figure who like just leads everyone through inspiration, and that leadership isn't done on the ground every day by ordinary, usually working class, because let's also talk about the class thing here, right? That it is working class people that lead these movements as well. If you look in Ferguson, like it was people living in poverty, people with like warrants on them, people that, were fighting to pay their bills. And that's who really led the beginnings of this movement. And I say that as somebody with class privilege, right? So the last thing I want to say is Kanye West, when he was running for president, said that Harriet Tubman didn't do anything but basically free slaves to work for white people. And I thought, well, there's a failure in understanding Black women's history. Because if you know anything about Harriet Tubman's life, Harriet Tubman had a vision of a world we're still trying to build today. She had what we might now name an abolitionist vision. It wasn't just that she freed enslaved people, which she did. It was also that the one time, for example, she ever got a paycheck when she was working for, during the Civil War, she was working as a nurse and as a spy because she had knowledge of the Southern terrain and was giving that to like the army. She was given money and she immediately formed a cooperative laundry with the other Black women who were working. And that, of course, they pooled their money and they created a business that enabled Black women to feed their families. So she had an economic vision that was collective and feminist, while men at the time were talking about going back and colonizing Africa. She was talking about building a different kind of world, a world where family structure was more broad. So she freed her favorite niece from the South, and she understood other mothering, and that we didn't need to have a nuclear family structure, which is very much created by capitalism, and that we had a much broader idea of community and family and love. And that's the Black feminist contribution, right? Black women have been talking about this for generations. This isn't new. The Combahee River Collective in 1972 talked about the importance of lesbian Black women specifically, and the vision that you have, because Black women as mothers, as queer people, as people that have lived a different life, bring a totally different perspective on organizing into the movement. The Black feminist movement begins out of the civil rights movement, where women noticed this. Obviously, they were like, how come it's always the men that are recognized and the women aren't recognized, and that there was sexual violence within the movement. And there's like Panther women who were raped by other Panthers and couldn't speak about it. And Black women know this, and Black women have been having this conversation for a long time. So I know Ayoka has talked about this as well, that we have to be careful with our history, not to pretend that it's only in this moment that suddenly women, suddenly started leading. Women always were leading. Women are always forming like radical visions. And women also always understood the problems of patriarchy, the problems of capitalism, and how a Black feminist approach, which isn't just for Black women, that approach encompasses all people, Black men, queer people, trans people, non-gender conforming people, non-binary people. That vision encompasses everybody. It's a very broad vision. So I know that was really long, but it's a good question.
Oh, this is all good points, though. I really enjoyed the historical aspect that you brought to this discussion as well. I don't know how much Sharisha would be able to add to this, but in your explanation, Sharisha, Elle raised this point of a diffused leadership structure. If you can touch on that, what does that mean? What does that look like? And if we think of other movements prior to the Black Lives Matter movement, you had, as Elle raised as well, you had one charismatic leader. When that leader is shot, the mission or the movement collapses. And in your discussion, can you talk a bit more about this diffused leadership structure that is associated with the Black Lives Matter movement?
I don't really know much on that subject there.
Or Elle, you can jump right back in there.
I think Sharisha, the question, and that was a really sort of technical term, that anyone can be a leader and anyone can step up. And that's something like you did this summer. So why, I guess you kind of answered this, but you know what I mean? Like, you didn't feel like you needed permission for anybody. You saw something needed to be done and you did it, right?
For sure, for sure. Well, you touched on this before that, like he said, that one leader is there, and then kind of when they are assassinated, that it ends the movement. And like Elle said in a prior question, that there are other people doing other things in different aspects, like, oh, I'll take care of this, and then this person takes care of that, so that there's no just one leader, so that, like you said, when that person falls, that the movement falls. So I just figured I would be a person to start that for Halifax and see other people to follow. For me personally, a leader isn't exactly what I'm looking for when it comes to this movement. To me, anybody who speaks up and just does their part is a leader to me, whether that's man, woman, trans, gay, anything. It doesn't matter to me. I'm not looking for a leader, and that's what I feel like everybody else should do. Like, I challenge other people to not look for a leader, because you can be a leader yourself. Just do what you need to do and take the horse by the reins and just go in for it.
That was awesome. Well said, Sharisha. I just want to switch gears because we are in the university setting. I'm sure that students and my colleagues who are listening will probably ask themselves now, well, how does this movement tie into my day-to-day work, or how does this look in my classroom? So, could you help me out to explain to my colleagues what Black Lives Matter looks like in our own setting, in the university setting, or in the case of an office? How could we explain Black Lives Matter to folks around us?
So what Black Lives Matter looks like on a sort of daily basis? Yeah, I mean, I think one of these things is that people have been having this conversation in their own place in the ways that make sense to them. So within the university, there's been a lot of talking about everything from, needing more Black scholarships, like making sure that Black students are able to come to university. There's been some good movement on this, for example, and it wasn't specifically like attributed to Black Lives Matter, but the Mount, for example, recently allowed kids that have been in the social welfare system, that have been in foster care, to come to university for free. That's obviously a huge barrier when you don't have, parents that are paying your fees, and you don't have those same kind of resources access to. And historically, yes, those kids have found that they're not able to get an education, not able to get the same resources together. That's, these kind of conversations about what are the barriers that existed for Black students, and of course for Black faculty. The Mount recently made a cohort hire. I'm like one of the people that was hired, meaning that we just hired a bunch of Black people. So we went from one permanent Black faculty member to like 5 or 6, but it took us till 2021 to do that. So there's been those kind of conversations about what it looks like in the classroom, who gets to come to university in the first place, right? Which is still a very middle class, very elite thing. More and more people are coming, but it's still, you're preparing to be the future middle class, right? Like, that's why you're in university. In like workplaces, many people have been talking about racism in the workplace, bullying in the workplace, the lack of people in leadership positions. All of those things have been part of what people are talking about. So entrepreneurship and like having the Black market in Halifax, there's been a lot of conversation around like Black businesses and ordering from Black businesses and making sure you support that. Transformative justice is a conversation, how we learn to heal conflict, how we learn to deal with each other. Do we have to turn to the prison system or the police, or is there another way to deal with harm and hold people accountable? That doesn't just mean you immediately forgive people, but how do communities have that conversation about violence in our own communities and how we can heal it? So there's not one conversation. You could talk to probably any Black person and get a different perspective on what Black Lives Matter means to them, because people are starting with the idea we have been excluded from all over the place. We have not been seen as human beings in a really broad level. So everywhere we stand, there are things to fight, and like whatever community you're in, no matter how progressive it seems, you're going to say, well, like the anti-war movement hasn't really talked too much about, like our responsibility or the racism within that. Ioka speaks a lot about the need to really think about disability, and she can talk about this more like in not only in like the white community, but among Black people as well. So there's not one narrative. It obviously begins with policing and state violence, like policing and prisons and justice. Like those are the sort of issues that started it, but people have taken it in all kinds of directions.
Oh, thank you. And I can get either Ayoka or Sharisha to jump in there and on to follow up on what Elle is talking about. Thank you, please.
Oh, thank you. Randy, in response to the question, the first thing that came to my mind when you're asking about how do we, I guess, when you're saying explain BLM to our colleagues or, within a university context, I immediately thought, Black Lives Matter work is decolonizing work. And it touches back on what Sharisha was saying about the individual responsibility or to take on accountability to do the work as well, so that you take on the piece that you can do. And so what that decolonizing work would look like in a university context would be not assuming that a person who is more melanated than those who have traditionally been in the front of the classroom or standing behind the admissions desk, not assuming that those individuals are unskilled, not assuming that those individuals will only be the receivers of service, allowing space for individuals who can be providers of services. Elle was saying about the hire that just happened. It's not just the hire, it's what environment do you create so that people actually can bring another perspective, another way of doing into the institution, and for that to be allowed to grow and be supported so that it can be sustained, not just in an individual hire, but institutionally. That decolonizing work for me also looks like the Board of Governors or the Senate at the Mount or any of these institutions of higher learning. The Board of Governors and the Senate composition impacts what the values are going to be of the institution and where the economic focus will be. So while it might seem admirable that scholarships are being offered for certain students, if the actual structure around that those students will be entering into really doesn't create space for them, then we're just moving them to another place in their lives where they end up with a lot more barriers. That then leads me to, open access as a form of decolonizing work, rather than accommodating an individual student who might come in with a disability or concern. And the accommodations kind of system makes those students feel as though they should be grateful. And my concern with the scholarships being offered to students that are who have come out of the foster care system, which I think is a wonderful idea, is again, what supports are there to say that this student is actually supported and given the opportunity to be able to grow, versus being told you're just here on because we had to let you be here. Because those messages are often given to students and people who are hired, who are, again, I will just say extra melanated. And then, so yes, looking at open access rather than one of the things that has, in the last few years, it's been touted a lot is this universal design, but that really brings us back to this notion of inclusion, which is assuming that the people that we have forced into the margins of their own lives, their only goal is to help maintain the center for those of us or those who are in power. So really creating opportunities for people to be able to live fully and centrally in their own lives. That's what decolonizing work looks like for me. And I tie that back to the BLM work.
Thank you. And Sharisha, would you have anything to add to that?
How I would describe Black Lives Matter to other people, not so much the university context there, because I didn't attend the university. I can't speak on the behalf of other people who have. But for me in the workplace, it's accountability and discussion. So accountability of self and others, and discussion as there needs to be room for discussion. I feel like workplaces don't leave room for discussion when it comes to Black Lives Matter or Black issues. For example, I worked at a job just recently that I had just left because of this issue. When I was trying to organize my protest, they wouldn't give me the time off that I needed to speak with people who were helping me organize, or they tried to even keep me my full shift, even though I had somebody to cover me the day of the protest. So I almost couldn't even make it to my own protest because there was no room for discussion. There was no room for them to understand that this is something that is a heavy topic, and especially for me being a person of color, other things like, promotions and stuff automatically, and it's sad that it happens, but you could be just as well trained as the next person, and the white guy gets the job, and you're going to assume that it's because you're Black that you don't get that position. And even if you were to try to bring that to management and say, hey, this is kind of how I'm feeling, it's automatically you're shut down. No, well, they just had this. There's no room for discussions, like I said. So I feel like that's what that is to me when it comes to the workplace.
Absolutely. All good points. I really love the answers to this question. Does anyone else have anything to add before I move to the next question? All right. So I'm going to wrap up with this final question, and just want to remind the audience that you're listening to three experts on this topic, Black Lives Matter. We're exploring it through the lens of All Lives Matter as well. We have Ayoka, Elle, and Sharisha with us today, and we're sitting under the baobab tree. And my next question is, and I just want you to picture this last question. Envision how it looks to both a white person and a Black person. For instance, in my area of research in Africentricity, as soon as someone hears that, they automatically think Africa, I want nothing to do with that. When we say Black Lives Matter, everyone automatically assumes, well, Black people, I want nothing to do with that. So can you help me to understand if Black Lives Matter is only for Black people, or can anyone else take the leadership in their community to lead a protest or to further expand the movement of Black Lives Matter within their community? Sharisha, I will get you to start on this one.
Absolutely. Anybody can jump onto this movement and do their piece. I can speak for my generation. We are loud. We are proud of everything. And they have been showing that. Even the youth are stepping up and doing their part. And that's amazing. I pride them on that because youth are never heard. And so they're trying to make that movement happen and be heard. And so many other people are stepping up and doing their part on this. So no, it is not just for Black people. It is for anybody. And you can make it for anybody, like Indigenous people, people of color, anybody, any situation that you see is unjust and you feel like it's not okay, then just step up and do your part if you feel like you can. If not, speak among friends. Maybe there's a friend that isn't so shy that can step up on your behalf or anything like that. But anybody can do your part. If you can do anything.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Ayoka, can you jump in on this one for me, please?
Sure. I think that Sharisha gave some good points there already, and so I'll just speak from my own perspective and experiences, which is to say that, again, coming from cultures where if there was work to be done, we all work together collectively to do the work. And it's incumbent upon me to take that, I know that I've been given the agency to take responsibility and to do something. So I need to also take, with that privilege comes the responsibility and accountability of actually doing where I can. And so because I run a business that's a service provider around access, one of the things that I do is to ensure that access is provided to people who are, as I said earlier, most on the margins. And what comes out of that, if I started to consider access as supporting those who are pushed further to the margins, what has come out of that is to see that everybody benefits from that. And so that's borne out again and again. And as I see the work that other people are doing, when there's that kind of care for everyone benefits. And so I guess I see myself as just wanting to continue to model that in my own little way. And hopefully that will also allow others to take that opportunity to do that in their own lives as well.
Thank you. And finally, Elle, you get to the last word on this question. Tell us, does anyone else get to speak on behalf of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, again, I think something I've been saying through the whole time is there's Black Lives Matter as it individually means to people, and Black Lives Matter as a political platform. As a political platform, there's specific things that Black Lives Matter is about. I don't think you can be pro-cop and then claim to be Black Lives Matter, for example, although there's Black people in their personal lives that may be pro-cop and also, take other principles of the movement. So yes, everybody can speak, but there is it's like feminism, right? Like there's specific things that are political demands, and then there's the idea that every woman can be empowered, right? And those are kind of like two separate things. And I would say the same thing for the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think, it's been said really well already. And something Ioka said right at the beginning of this podcast was, you shouldn't hear only Black Lives Matter. You should hear when Black Lives Matter, all lives will matter. And, within the labor movement, there's a saying, a high tide lifts all boats, right? So there's this idea that anything that more white people are shot by the police in Canada because there's more white people. So when we talk about police shootings and police brutality, that benefits white people as well. The work we do on justice benefits white people. Like, it's not just Black people. When you fight for the people that have been held in the margins the longest, and when you fight for those people to get rights, those rights extend to everybody. So anything we're fighting for and already explicitly have fought for is going to benefit everybody. But there is also nothing wrong with us as Black people claiming our space, speaking for Black people, speaking about ourselves, speaking without fear of being Black, unapologetically Black, as the t-shirts say, right? For too long, we've had to excuse ourselves or be ashamed of ourselves or keep our heads down or not speak about this or that, or, apologize for ourselves, straighten our hair, keep our voices calm, not use the language that we use, not speak in our accents, not dress how we want to dress. And that's changing, and it has changed. And now we can be as Black as we want to be, and we want to be as Black as we want to be. And that also means that we get to claim ourselves, and we don't have to worry, what will other people say? Will somebody be offended by me being Black? Will somebody like or dislike if I talk about my own life? Is somebody going to be mad if I do something for Black people that's just for Black people? We are allowed to do all those things too. And I think that's really important. We get to be people like everybody else. And we get to be the full range of people with the full set of emotions, make the same mistakes. Like those are all part of us being human. And that's ultimately, I think, what we're fighting for.
Thank you. And all three of you have been really great participants of this podcast today. I want to thank you. You're experts in your own right, and you are leaders in your own right. I look up to all three of you. Ayoka, thank you. Elle and Sharisha, thank you for participating in this podcast. And you remember that when...
Oh, sorry, I didn't interrupt you. I was just saying thank you for putting this together and for centering the voices of women.
Thank you again. And at any point, anyone else wants to jump in and say any final words?
I just want to say thank you for Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I just wanted to thank everybody for being here and actually taking the time to do this, because it does matter and people need to hear it from all different voices and all different perspectives. And I really appreciate you guys.
And I absolutely agree with all that's been said. Thank you, everyone. And I will just sort of throw out the idea of maybe continuing these kinds of discussions. You have this platform, Randy, so and thank you for recognizing, as Elle was saying, to bring the voices of women forward. So just maybe thinking about continuing on in the future, how this will continue to live and give other people the opportunity to speak as well.
Absolutely. You've been under the mobile tree with us, and we have enjoyed each and every moment with Ayoka, Elle, and Sharisha today. And I hope that you'll join us in our other podcasts as we plan and continue to get through this 12-part series ending in February of 2022. Thank you for listening to us today.